Do you need me to log in just to make sure it's live? Yeah. If you really want to see yourself.
I see it. Yep. Good evening and welcome. We're going to go ahead and begin. In this essay, I will explain how Do became attached to the name of many contemporary East Asian martial arts, such as Judo, Kendo, Karate Do, Tae Kwon Do, and Hapkido. Although the roots of the terminology and concepts trace back thousands of years, both the terminology and their interpretation have evolved substantially across time and cultures. While it is possible to explain Do through ancient religions and broad philosophical traditions, these are mostly precursors rather than core drivers. In fact, the primary reasons for the adoption of Do is more closely tied to the construction of national identity in the early 1900s in Japan and the 1950s in Korea, and a reframing of the martial arts ethical structures that emerged in the aftermath of World War II. At present, Do continues to play a part in ongoing questions and conflicts involving national identity, cultural ownership, and social exclusion in the martial arts. The concept of Do exists along a continuum line ranging from the cosmos as a totality to specific individual behaviors. While discussing Do, it is possible to zoom in or out or to set arbitrary boundaries and only focus on the specific portions of Tao. I refer to these points of view as lenses, of which there can be wider lenses or narrower lenses. The broad lenses are metaphysical and ontological in nature. Such lenses might derive from religious traditions such as Taoism or Buddhism, but not all involve spirituality. For example, a Confucian view of Tao would constitute a broad philosophical lens, but not a religious one. A broad lens could also come from less well defined or even personal philosophies. But regardless of origin, the broad lenses concern existence, reality, and the nature of being. We can contrast possible broad lenses with narrow lenses, which involve social ethical concepts, such as the way that citizenship or specific cultural concepts are constructed and understood. So, I have a brief note of caution. While these lenses are helpful communication tools, they should not be taken to create a strict dichotomy. I'm not particularly trying to create new categories to sort the concept of Tao. I am showing that Tao exists along a sliding scale of magnification. At the greatest level of magnification, this can involve individual specific behaviors, but it can also be zoomed out all the way to the level of universal philosophies. In this essay, I will sometimes mention broad or narrow lenses as a common reference point to better communicate the level of magnification currently being discussed. Okay, so a couple quick notes, some technical notes and housekeeping. Before we dive into this too deeply, I do want to say that it is my mission to keep this to an hour and a half. This is going to be a pretty intense, terminologically driven historical deep dive. And my concern is that I'm not going to be able to cover everything. In fact, I know from rehearsal I'm not. So, what we're going to do is we're going to cut this short when we get to the portion shortly after Judo was created. We are not going to be able to discuss what I had hoped, which is how the ethical structures of Tao changed in the martial arts after World War II, or how they were translated in Korea in the 1950s and 1960s. We are going to have to do a second part to this in order to cover it. And I think that's a better option as opposed to turning this hour and a half long lecture into a 2 hour, 3 hour long lecture. I find that even 30 minutes of a deep historical dive is often sufficient, and we're doing triple that. So we're going to keep it to an hour and a half. Okay. So before we move into the main body, I would like to address some housekeeping items. Martial arts form their identity as much from the vocabulary as their underlying concepts or physical movements. The words we use to describe martial arts constructs and projects the identity of a given art. The amount of vocabulary can be extensive and specialized. This creates some burden on the novices and even more experienced persons in some cases. Okay, I've just received a message. We're sharing a blank screen. Ben, can you check on that real quick? I hope that's not the case. cultural concepts. We're pausing just for a second. So it's a blank screen? Okay. So try this. Okay. Let's try one more time. Thanks for showing me that. Okay. Give it a few seconds. All right. We are going to bypass this then. Okay, let's continue. So we won't be able to show the presentation, but we can show me talking. So let's do that. So in this essay, I will be surveying 3,000 years of history and three different languages, some of which have evolved over time. This will include examining terminology that has conceptually progressed, archaic words no longer in use, Chinese characters in both traditional and simplified forms, and various methods of rendering terms in the Latin alphabet. Rather than retreat from complexity, I have chosen to embrace it in this essay. This material may initially seem daunting to persons newer to the material, but I encourage you to fully engage with it anyway. Over time, as you revisit these concepts, I hope that growing familiarity will lead to deeper comprehension. I have given consideration to the best method of rendering East Asian words into the Latin alphabet. So from this point forward, I will use pinyin with tone marks for Chinese words. I will do so because Mandarin is a tonal language, and pinyin offers a high degree of precision in this regard. I will make a few exceptions for certain well-known words such as Dao, for which I will use the older Wade-Giles method, as these are already well established in American English. For Japanese, I will employ Hepburn romanization and include diacritics for greater accuracy. After careful thought, I have decided to use Korean Revised Romanization System, as it is widely accepted, accessible, and clear to English speakers. In this work, I will use the initial version of any translated term for consistency. When quoting other sources, I will retain their chosen spelling and transliteration method. In some cases, I may include variations or additional information to provide clarity. This principle also applies to how personal and family names are presented. I'm going to follow the Western convention of first name followed by family name. Generally, I will not use honorifics when referring to individuals, except where historical usage compels their use. For instance, I would be referred to as Jonathan Semetko rather than as Semetko Jonathan, Semetko Sensei, Master Semetko, or so on. Okay. I recognize that some subjects I will be treating on are sensitive. Some of these matters involve painful chapters in the histories of nations or groups, which may even exist within living memory. I acknowledge that the way we construct and project our identities is very close to our sense of personhood. I do feel some weight towards the consideration of the feeling and lived experience of others. I balance this against my desire to relay historical information in as factual a manner as I can. It is my view that I can accomplish both tasks, even if imperfectly. Please know that if this essay offends in any way, then I regret it deeply. I hope ultimately my work here will be seen as an effort to build up a deep understanding of history and provide a sincere reflection point, as opposed to an attempt to tear down or invoke pain. I have made efforts to ensure that my sources are accurately cited, due credit and correct paraphrasing and fact verification are given. However, engaging in this sort of in-depth cultural and historical analysis comes with a high risk of errors in facts or interpretation, for which I take full responsibility. Any errors in translation, fact, or analysis are my own. So let's begin with analyzing the character for Dao. So, given a Chinese pinyin reading, you have Dao, which is road, path, or way. Dao is a compound character composed of two component glyphs. You have Shou, which means head, and Chuo is a radical that represents walk or movement. Shou serves as the phonetic component, providing a clue to the pronunciation of Dao. While Shou is pronounced Shou and Dao is pronounced Dao, they share similar vowel sounds, and their pronunciations were closer in historical forms of Chinese. Chut is a radical, which is a symbol that helps categorize Dao in dictionaries alongside characters with related meanings. The radical also contributes to the semantic meaning of the character Dao by associating it with paths or movements. So, this type of compound character is what's known as a phonosemantic compound. So, Tao is a central idea in Taoism, but it also exists in Buddhism, Confucianism, legalism, and other pursuits. The common uniting theme is the connection from an application or philosophy to one's whole life, or even the cosmos at large. I propose that Tao can be seen as analogous to inductive reasoning. It connects from the narrower or the more specific to the broader or even universal. I will also caution that this is somewhat interpretive on my part. While Tao conceptually scales from the specific to the universal, historians and sinologists don't really refer to Tao in this way. This is my interpretation of Tao. Specific examples might include the duties of a ruler or the obligations of a child to a parent. These ideas are taken and then extended outward toward universal principles. If we take the broad perspective, Tao represents the ultimate way or path that governs the cosmos and human behavior. Over time, this understanding of Tao as a philosophical scaffold made it applicable to various roles and social ethical frameworks. The earliest form of the character Tao appears in the Western Zhou dynasty of 1046 to 771 before the Common Era and was found in bronze inscriptions. At that time, the character Tao had not yet taken on the broader philosophical frameworks that would emerge later. Tao was used in a more straightforward sense for road or path or way. This usage was also sometimes metaphorically extended to mean method or the proper way of doing something. So, even in this very early period, there was already a metaphorical extension of the physical concept of Tao, but it was not yet fully developed, nor was there even such a thing as Taoism at this point. The earliest writings that were later claimed to be Taoist emerged in the 4th century before the Common Era. These writings concern various self cultivation and spiritual practices used to connect with deeper realities. The actual term for Taoism was coined later still in the early Han Dynasty that began in 202 before the Common Era. These Han Dynasty Taoists retroactively applied the label Taoist or Daoqia to a variety of older philosophical and spiritual texts from the Warring States period. Once Taoism developed as a self conscious religious and intellectual tradition, the compilers of the Taoist literary canon included many of these earlier texts. They did so to draw on the prestige and antiquity of these materials, thereby propping up their own historical legitimacy. Kirkland 2002 writes In reality, the classical roots of Taoism lay in the practices of unknown men and women who tried to refine and transform themselves to obtain full integration with life's deepest realities. Eventually, around the 4th century BCE, some of them anonymously wrote about such practices, urging others to engage in them, thereby solving life's problems. In time, such self cultivation practices were even marketed as a solution to social and political problems. This is a time when there was both competition and syncretism with other major intellectual currents such as Confucianism, Moism, and legalism. As intellectual competition intensified, Confucians reinterpreted Tao into a guiding social ethical principle, and both Taoist and Confucian writing, Tao increasingly became linked to other ideas. The ancient Chinese extensively used the character for Tao to help describe moral principles, philosophical paths, and socio-ethical problems. While the concept of Tao can sometimes be abstract, it was in other cases anchored to far more concrete applications. Along these lines, the concept of Tao was sometimes used to articulate the expected behaviors and responsibilities of specific roles, societal groups, and specific professions. This occurs even before the expression of formalized Taoism. We can find examples in classical works in the spring and autumn period of 77 through 476 BCE and the Warring States periods of 475 through 221 BCE in the Tao Te Ching, but also Confucian texts such as the Analects or the Doctrine of the Mean. Taoism emerged as a coherent school of thought in the early Han Dynasty. Tao was molded and reshaped in response to intellectual and political pressures across these long years. The Han was also a period of syncretism in which Taoist, Confucian, Mohist, and other thought systems began to both systemize and share certain concepts and terminology. In other words, although they were sometimes in competition, they also were self-systematizing, and they also were sharing concepts across. Various literary canons or classics, or jing, were being assembled into schools of thought by scholars and librarians of this period. In time, Tao was woven into other terminology. An example of this sort of philosophically combinative term is the compound word Tao De, the way and the virtue, or if you prefer, the way and its power. In time, the word Tao De came to mean morality, although its early meaning was somewhat different. While Tao and De are fundamental concepts in both Taoism and Confucianism, Tao De initially indicated the philosophical virtue of following the way. An example of movement towards the establishment of Tao De as a compound term is found in the Tao Te Ching. However, although Tao and De appear next to each other in the title, this title was only retroactively applied. Lao Tzu was a more common early designation for the text and the title of the Tao Te Ching, and that title of Tao Te Ching became standard only after editorial processes later in the Han era. In the total work, both terms are used extensively. Tao is mentioned 70 times, and De is mentioned 40 times. And in fact, the Tao Te Ching is considered to be divided into two subparts, which are named, predictably, Tao and De. There are different versions of the Tao Te Ching, but in the commonly received version, the first 37 verses primarily focus on the concept of Tao, while verses 38 through 81 shift to explore De. Here, Tao is the overarching, all pervasive principle that underlies everything, and De is the subtle power or virtue that comes from being in accord with the way. While we do not find the compound term Tao De in the Tao Te Ching, with the exception of the retroactive title, we do find both terms in close proximity and explained as interrelated in verse 51. So, looking at verse 51, the verse reads, and this is my translation: The Tao gives them life, virtue nurtures them, matter shapes them, circumstances completes them. So, to be clear, in the Tao Te Ching, both the compound word Tao De and its later meaning of morality has not quite emerged yet. Tao and De are found in close proximity in the work, but refer to the order of the universe and the virtue that comes from moving with that order. Although the Tao Te Ching pairs these concepts in the text, and the characters appear together in the retroactive title, the compound term Tao De only emerged as a specific compound word somewhat later. In the Tao Te Ching, we don't find a compound term using Tao, but we do find an example of the bridging of concepts. This reflects broader trends, as there was a linguistic and conceptual shift that occurred between the early and later Warring States periods. The scholar Els, drawing upon the work of another scholar, describes how earlier works such as the Mozu, Laozu, and Xuanshu inner chapters tend to treat key philosophical concepts as distinct standalone terms. And later works, such as the Zhangzhu outer and miscellaneous chapters, often combine formerly separate philosophical vocabulary into compound words. So understand that these works are often compilations that editorially accreted chapters over time, so they did not emerge fully formed. and that the textual layers of works like the Zhanju are debated. Some inner chapters are likely older than the outer chapters. Philosophical compound words became common, and by the late Warring States subperiod, the compound Tao Te is found directly in other works. Later in the Han, Tao Te took on an increasingly moral and ethical dimension. This can be linked to the ascendancy of Confucianism, but also the exchange of concepts and terminology between different schools of thought in the same period. Tao retained a metaphysical dimension, but was presented in Confucian writings as the correct ethical path or guiding principle for both ruler and subject. Over time, Tao Te came to mean both the alignment with the cosmic order and adherence to a moral order in human affairs. And Tao did not remain limited to general metaphysical or moral concepts. Additional terminological links began to be extended into practical areas of human life. We can find other examples of these type of extensions and linkages. The way of filial piety, the way of the ruler, the way of the minister, the way of medicine. So these are examples of how Tao became attached to various aspects of ancient Chinese life. They link specific roles and practices to universal philosophical frameworks. In this worldview, individual actions are part of a greater cosmology, and when actions are performed correctly, they are in harmony with that cosmology. This is how the narrow duties of a minister, for example, could become philosophically linked to the evolutions and permutations of the cosmos. This is also how the scaling or magnification found within the concept of Tao changes particular role based ethics into part of a greater philosophical framework. Within Confucianism, Tao is interpreted in a social context, focusing on one's duties as a member of society. Confucian cosmology holds that the way of humanity, or Rendao, corresponds to the way of heaven, Tiandao. The Confucian way of humanity involves practicing benevolence, righteousness, and propriety. The scholar Huang in 2001 explains because Confucian cosmology suggests that the way of humanity corresponds to the way of heaven, Confucians required individuals to cultivate themselves with the way of humanity. Huang situates these concepts within the general intellectual milieu of the pre Qin era, drawing connections to cosmological views prevalent during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, as well as to foundational Confucian texts and early sages such as Confucius and Mencius. One example of this is the explicitly Confucian term Junji Shidao, the way of the gentleman, which is found in multiple ancient texts such as the Analects and the Doctrine of the Mean and the Book of Rites. Huane explains that the way of humanity is twofold. It includes ethics for ordinary people who emphasize observing proper hierarchical relationships and following principles of distributive justice. This justice refers to how resources, benefits, and obligations are fairly allocated among individuals within a relational framework informed by Confucian ethics. He also describes a separate ethics for scholars who bear the additional duty of applying these moral principles to benefit society as a whole. The underlying premise is that by understanding and imitating the way of heaven, Confucians constructed the way of humanity, thereby giving every person the moral obligation to practice self cultivation and embody the virtues and maintain harmony between individuals, society, and the greater cosmos. One word that was conspicuous by its absence in historical China is Wudao, or the martial ways. All the pieces were present for this particular compound word to emerge. There were extensive linkages between the martial arts of ancient China and the broad currents of Chinese historical thought, including Taoism, Confucianism, legalism, Mohism, and Buddhism. The word Tao had already taken on extensive philosophical meanings, and Tao was already being used in other compound words. In spite of this, the characters for Tao and Wu, or martial, were never physically linked, although you could probably convincingly argue that they were conceptually linked by this point. So, certainly conceptually broad words existed, such as Wu Dei, martial virtue, and Wu Gong, or martial achievement. Wu Dei was also the name assigned to one of the reigns of one of the Tang emperors in ancient China. in 618 through 626 BC. Other words that made specific reference to historical Chinese martial arts, such as Wu Yi and Wushu, among others, were used to fill this niche. At present, it is possible to find the word Wu Dao on the internet in reference to the Chinese martial arts, but it's found in very recent Chinese or Western sources. You're not going to find historical references to it. So we have to look elsewhere for the historical emergence of that particular link term. When the characters for Wu Dao are given their Japanese onyomi reading, the word is pronounced Budo, and that word is found extensively in Japanese history. Okay. I will now move towards explaining the Japanese understanding of Do or Dao. While this portion is extensive, it's necessary to properly understand why Do is used in the names of so many of the various East Asian martial arts, including non-Japanese martial arts. While it's possible to connect Do to the names of other martial arts using broad lenses, such as the Korean cultural understanding or Korean Taoism specifically, and indeed some Korean and Western authors who are involved in the Korean martial arts have done exactly that. However, this is only possible by limiting the analysis to really wide, really broad lenses and intentionally de-emphasizing the narrower, more tightly connected lenses. Relevant to this is the emergence of a group of people known as the Shi class. The Shi emerged in the Zhou dynasty, so quite a long time ago. They were initially the knightly class, or they were on the level of low-level aristocratic warriors, but they evolved into a class of hereditary scholar officials. Beginning in the Sui dynasty of 581 to 618 of the Common Era, the imperial examination system formalized the role of the Shi class as civil servants. The Shi were the lower ranking officials and scholars within the imperial bureaucracy of ancient China. The Shi were responsible for record keeping, correspondence, and other clerical duties that supported the governance of the state. The Shi were engaged in civil administration and also scholarly pursuits. The Shi class became influential cultural and moral leaders during the Southern Song dynasty of 1127 through 1279 of the Common Era, and Yuan dynasties of 1271 through 1368. In later Chinese commentaries, scholars began to summarize the virtues expected of the Shi in Confucian terms. The Shi reinforced ethical standards and promoted a strong sense of moral responsibility within their communities. The Shi were also instrumental in compiling gazetteers, which are local histories and geographies, which document a wide variety of information on the smaller scale. They rendered history a great service by recording biographies of virtuous individuals, details of local geography, and of various regional customs. So they were a people who wrote about every little thing. And so part of the reason we have such good records of ancient China is because they were such prolific writers. Confucian ethical frameworks influenced Japanese thought as Chinese culture entered Japanese society in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. The Confucian focus on personal, social, ethical development was foundational to societal institutions that developed later in Japan. The Chinese writing system was also part of this cultural extension, and the character Shi would have been among the many characters that were introduced at this time. Although Shi in early Japan drew upon the Chinese scholar official concept, it was not perfectly identical, and it was altered to fit into Japan's own courtly structure. However, the Japanese Shi of this time can still be understood as scholar officials within the greater Japanese bureaucracy. So, early Japanese rulers understood warfare along very Confucian lines. They framed military action along the same ethical constructs as civil police actions. Therefore, any military action was expressed and understood as part of a ruler's duty to maintain social order under the greater cosmology. In the late Heian period of 794 through 1185 of the Common Era in Japan, The decline of central authority led local elites, including of the Japanese shi class, to take up arms, and this began to blur the lines between scholar officials and warriors. The meaning of the character shi shifted, and it became associated with the rising warrior class and began to be combined with the character of wu, or, if given a Japanese reading, bu, which is martial, to form a new compound word, or jakugo, which is bushi, which means martial gentleman. In the early Kamakura period of 1185 through 1333, with the Common Era, the term bushi gained prominence, but at the same time, a separate and synonymous term of samurai, or one who serves, also became widely used. To better explain this, I will spend some time disambiguating and exploring the vocabulary. The Japanese reading of the character for Dao can be mishi if given the kunyomi reading, such as is typically used for a single character word. The character for Dao could also be read as do if given the onyomi reading that is generally used when part of a multi-character word or jakugo, such as the word budo or judo. In historical Japanese examples, you will therefore see the character for Dao represented sometimes as mishi and sometimes as do. The term Budo martial ways existed in the past in Japan, and by the Kamakura period of 1185 through 1333, it was being used synonymously with the terms Bujitsu and Buge. At this point, we need to pause and spend some time dislodging the misunderstandings about these terms. There is a Western understanding of Do versus Jutsu that has both conceptual and terminological problems. We can find examples even in current Western formal scholarship. And this is that the Bujitsu were practical affairs, whereas the Budo that emerged later in the Meiji Restoration were focused on moral, philosophical, or self perfection attributes. The false dichotomy employed here is that Jitsu implies an orientation to the physical technique, whereas Do implies a focus on philosophical concepts. But this is not true in fact or name. All three terms of Budo, Buge, and Bujitsu carry an implication of aesthetic and carry an implication of aesthetic and philosophical connections. Jitsu is used in Japanese words like bujitsu, or if you prefer, jujitsu, can be understood to mean words like art, technique, skill, means, tricks, resources, or magic. So, to give you an example of some other uses of jitsu, we have the term bijitsu, which refers to fine arts like painting and sculpture. Bi means beauty, so bijitsu focuses on artistic beauty and visual form. You could also have the term geijitsu. This is a more comprehensive term meaning the arts or artistic endeavor and encompasses fine arts, literature, performing arts. Geijitsu is also used in modern Japanese to mean art in a broader academic or cultural sense. Others have pointed out that Japanese martial arts termed jitsu still often had philosophical or aesthetic focus too, and that such a position is not unique to the martial arts that adopt the suffix do. In older source material, terms like jitsu, do, heho, etc., were not sharply distinguished the way they sometimes are understood today. Just going to be right back. Friday and Humitaki in 1997 point out that the Jutsu-Do distinction is far more modern and malleable than many realize. Professor Raul Sanchez Garcia in 2018 criticized Don Draeger and the haplological school of thought he founded for promoting an oversimplified view that separates Bujitsu and Budo into mutually exclusive categories. In Professor Garcia's view, Draeger presents Bujitsu as purely practical and combat oriented, while casting Budo as fundamentally focusing on moral and philosophical self development, and that Draeger's work fails to capture their overlapping nature. Garcia argues that Bujitsu is conceptually never limited to technical skill. It had always included philosophical and ethical dimensions even before the Meiji Restoration. Further, Garcia points out that terms like Budo, Bugei, and Bujitsu were frequently used interchangeably in historical Japanese context. The gradual inclusion of moral cultivation and self discipline began long before the Meiji Restoration, especially as Japan moved towards greater societal stability during the Tokugawa period, or the early modern period, or the Edo period. All terms for the same thing. Some people even call it the Pax Tokugawa. This historical interplay suggests that rather than being a hard and fast division, Jitsu and Do are two closely related terms that evolve in a largely shared time frame. While some post World War II Japanese writers do use Jits and Do in different ways, this distinction is not as and white as some Western Budo literature might suggest. The lines can be blurry, and the meaning of Do versus Jitsu is contingent on historical and organizational context. As opposed to a dichotomy, Garcia introduces a useful lens that I think is worth further discussion. Garcia employs an Alesian process sociological framework to show how Jitsu and Do developed as part of a long term social and cultural evolution rather than as distinct categories with fixed ideological boundaries. Drawing upon Norbert Elias's figurational sociology, Garcia argues that these martial traditions were shaped over the centuries by complex social ethical processes, including both civilizing and decivilizing trends. The Elysian lens reveals changes to the Japanese martial arts to be dynamic and, to a degree, tidal. The Japanese Budo were cultural formations that were continuously renegotiated by individuals, institutions, and broader societal influences. And I think this perspective dislodges the tendency to place Jitsu and Do as neatly separated and instead presents them as mutually constitutive. They emerge from political realignments, informalization, and technological change. So, to put it more directly, what emerges from Garcia's Elasian analysis is a view of the Japanese martial arts that's far more fluid and adaptive than some of the preceding work. I think that considering Elias's concepts of civilizing and decivilizing trends helps clarify a critical point, namely that the Japanese martial arts did not slowly and inevitably march towards increasing moral refinement. Instead, there were various methods of heightened militarization and a refocus on external affairs, which were countered by tidal movements of increased self restraint and a focus on moral cultivation. The various pendulum swings of civility and its breakdown is part of the fundamental complexity of how these traditions evolved over time. In short, the Japanese martial arts evolved within various cycles of refinement and aggression, shaped by shifting internal social values and also by external historical drivers. So we've known for some time that Draeger's work contributed to some misunderstanding in Western scholarship. And Draeger's work in this regard has come under increasing criticism in the serious scholarship. And I do agree that Draeger contributed to such a distinction. But I would argue that this distinction was actually constructed much earlier by Jigoro Kano and the Bushido theorist in the early 1900s in Japan. Professor Oleg Benich in 2021 writes, as in other cases, Kano's stress on spiritual aspects was partially a marketing strategy that set his school apart from past practice. So, in partial defense of Draeger, I think he had a much better balanced position than is currently sometimes acknowledged. As I have written elsewhere, in his 1973 work, Classical Budo, the late Don Draeger explored the changes within the Koru over time. Draeger, a United States Marine and founder of Hoplology, which is the study of human combative behavior, analyzed the efficacy of Koru, developed in the earlier modern period, and the later Gende Budo, such as Judo. His critical view of these developments, as discussed in classical Budo and other works, has sometimes prompted criticism within the Judo community, especially as regards his arguments about efficacy and other criticisms Draeger made of contemporary Judo. Draeger's observations and criticisms are based on his deep understanding of cultural history. His hoplology is a holistic approach to the study of history, anthropology, sociology, and the psychology of the martial arts. His approach is, in fact, a systemic scholarly approach to the study of the martial arts. He was particularly interested in traditional martial arts, and he spent considerable time in Japan and other parts of Asia studying and practicing various forms. His work contributed significantly to understanding the cultural, historical, and technical aspects of the East Asian martial arts. So, Draeger's chief point when comparing the Koru, or the old schools of Japanese martial arts that developed earlier, to the ones that developed later, is that the earlier schools are combatively balanced. They are military schools. Any jujitsu or use of minor weapons that existed in these early Koru are secondary or even tertiary to the primary weapon systems and combative intention of the earlier Koru. Draeger's view was therefore holistic and acknowledged differences of intentionality in the Rua of various time periods. This holistic view also includes how the intentionality within the Koru changed in relation to societal changes. In this sense, judo was an evolution of jujitsu, which had been altered to survive and then later thrive in the early to mid Meiji period and the periods that immediately followed. The samurai had changed over time. The samurai changed because their society and also their role within that society had changed. Therefore, while not identical, these things are fundamentally entangled. Draeger's definition of Koru versus Gendai Budo, or literally modern Budo, are regarding effectiveness and spiritual versus combative aspects, or Draeger's criticism of competitive judo, occasionally rankled certain judo practitioners in the United States. In my experience, Draeger tends to be a polarizing figure among American judoka of a certain age. It's also true that not all of his scholarship has stood the test of time. But I think we need to acknowledge our own sociological shifts since the time of Draeger's death in 1982. So there are now three internationally accredited scholarly journals that specialize in the martial arts. I know it's an odd way to think about it, but sometimes scholarship in a given subfield advances based on the number and quality of the publishing source. And there's something else too. Draeger died over 40 years ago, and yet here we all are still talking about Draeger scholarship. And even if we're talking about it as a launch pad, as a point of departure, we're still talking about it. And I think that's a credit to his work. So, setting aside Draeger and the Jitsu Do dichotomy and moving back towards a historical linguistic analysis of other related terms, we can compare the term Budo to the far older term Bugei, which literally means martial arts. The term began to be used in Japan around the 8th century, primarily associated with the martial skills and techniques of the military aristocrats. During this time, Bugei was a generic term for martial practices focused on warfare, but over time, Bugei became synonymous with Bujitsu and Budo, as these practices evolved alongside the rise of the samurai class. Okay. The term Bugei has deep roots, going back at least 500 years prior in Japan, where it was read as Wuyi, and first appeared in this exact form in China as early as the 3rd century of the Common Era. The second word yi, as found within the compound word wu yi, dates back even further still to the Zhou dynasty. And this was included in the six arts, or Li Yi, which a gentleman would be educated in ancient China. Wu Yi is comparable to a similar but more familiar term, wushu, which emerged in the 6th century in certain literary works. Although the term kung fu is much better known in the West, wushu is the predominant term used in China, although the second character now uses a simplified form. And the characters for wushu, when given the Japanese reading, become the familiar term bujitsu. So if we were to compare the characters for wudao, wu, and wushu, the same characters will be read in Japanese as budo, buge, and bujitsu, which are all in use. And also in Korean. So to give them their Korean pronunciation, they are mudo, muye, and musul, which are also in use. So this is an example of the characters and concepts that are shared. Although Garcia shows that the terms Bugei, Bujitsu, and Budo are relatively synonymous, prior to the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the word Budo could also be understood to mean what we now call Bushido, the way of the warrior, which I define as a total social ethics of the samurai class. Historically, the specific term Bushido did exist, but in the past it was less commonly used compared to other terms. Over time, the meaning of Budo shifted. At present, the term Budo usually refers to the Gendai Budo, which is literally modern Budo, which are the martial arts that have their origin in the late 1800s or early 1900s in Japan, such as Judo, Karate-do, and Kendo, and others. We can contrast the Gendai Budo with what we now call the classical Budo or Koru Budo, or sometimes Kobudo, literally the old school Budo that existed before the Meiji Restoration. Historically in Japan, there were a range of other terms using the character do that were used to describe either general Japanese martial arts, or specific Japanese martial arts, or an aspect about the martial arts, or the philosophical attachment of the martial arts to a broader currents of existence, or to what we now call Bushido. We have some examples. They include, but they're not limited to Bushido, the way of the warrior, Yumiya no Mishi, and once again, Mishi is just a different Japanese reading of the character for Do, which is the way of the bow and arrow. Bushi no Mishi, the way of the warrior. The same characters could also be read as Mononofu no Mishi. Mononofu is an archaic term for samurai. A little bit of a tongue twister there. You also have Otoku no Mishi, the manly ways, Hoku no Mishi, the way of service, Bushi no Seto, the true way of the warrior, Shiro, the way of the gentleman warrior, Budo no Jinmi, the investigation of the martial ways, and Budogu no Jinmi, the investigation of martial implements. Okay. In summary of the previous, we can see that there was historically a pool of relatively synonymous terms for the martial culture in Japan. For example, Bujitsu, Bugei, Budo, Hyoho, etc. Narrowing this to terminology employing Do specifically, there's a separate pool of terms that were historically in use. While in the contemporary sense, you can disentangle some of these terms. For example, Budo from Bushido. Historically, the lines are a lot more blurred. I think it's most correct to say that a large pool of vocabulary became attached over the centuries to Japanese martial arts. Although not identical in precise meaning, these terms conceptually overlapped to some degree, and at points in history, significantly so. They were also subject to ideological shifts within certain time frames. So I'm going to zoom in on the term Shido as a case in point. In the early modern period, there were said to be four classes. So Shi no Kosho, these same characters and the underlying concept were also used in ancient China. The term Shido originally focused on the ethical and moral responsibilities of the Bushi class. It was first articulated in depth during the early modern period, possibly by Soko Yamaga, who lived from 1622 to 1685 of the Common Era. Yamaga reframed warrior ethics heavily along Confucian lines. A wide variety of terms emerged that were synonymous with Shido, including Bushido, but the concept was never limited to those terms. As late as the early 1890s, Bushido theorists such as Masahisa Umura and Shikara Suzuki were still using the term Shido, but it was rapidly being displaced by the term Bushido. Professor Oleg Benich notes that prior to the Meiji Restoration, Shido was actually more commonly used in Japan than the term Bushido. He explains another factor that affected references to Shido in Meiji Japan was its close connection with Confucianism. Unlike Bushido, Shido was originally a Chinese term and was not immune to the increasingly negative views of China that developed at the end of the 19th century. So, in other words, it was Shido's perceived connection to China generally and Confucianism specifically that contributed to its replacement by the more distinctly Japanese term Bushido, even though these terms share two out of three characters. Shido is actually a term of uncertain origin. Although I have conducted only a very preliminary search, I have not thus far located Shido in any classical Chinese sources. Okay? It seems more likely that the term was coined by Soko Yamaga in the early modern period. The use of shi as opposed to bushi is likely intentional, reflecting Yamaga's emphasis on a Confucian centric viewpoint of the samurai used in his writing. The same Confucian and arguably Chinese inspired term of shido was then rejected in favor of a term that felt more authentically Chinese later on by the early Bushido theorist. So the term Bushido itself is not as old as sometimes thought. It appears to have emerged in the early modern period and to have fallen heavily out of disuse by the start of the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Excuse me. The Japanese Christian author Inazo Notobi, who lived 1862 to 1933, in 1900 published what is still the best known English language work of Bushido, which is Bushido, the Soul of Japan. Notobe actually thought he coined the term Bushido. He did not, and only became aware of this much later. So, this is not to say there was nothing conceptually similar to Bushido that existed prior to the Meiji Restoration, but that other terms such as Budo, or one of its synonyms, were used to represent the socio-ethics of the Bushi class. However, Bushido, by whatever name, is a concept that is somewhat nebulous. The Bushido theorists of the 1890s and early 1900s approached the subject from a variety of viewpoints that were often in competition and had a lot more to do with the social politics of the day than any historical understanding of Bushido. After the end of World War II, a number of authors went to some length to disentangle Bushido, the Bushido of pre World War II Japan, and a more historical Bushido that may have existed prior to the Meiji Restoration. An example would be Carl Friday's wonderfully named 1994 article, Bushido or Bull, a medieval historian's perspective on the Imperial Army and the Japanese warrior tradition. I love that title. However, complications with trying to cite a specific historical Bushido exist as well. There were various kakun, or house codes, and formulations of how bushi should conduct themselves or what their values were, but these were never a unified set. The notion of what could be called Bushido experienced significant conceptual and terminological drift in Japan over the course of 1,000 years, even as the Bushi themselves evolved and changed in various ways over time. The evolution of Shi to Bushi and from Shido to Bushido is an example of how these terms were altered based on changing social ethics within Japan. So, just to review, we have some shared terminology: Shido, Bushi, and Bushido. Okay. So, the Japanese historically used various forms of the character Do to describe their martial arts. And even prior to the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Do was sometimes attached as a suffix to the end of a specific martial art. For example, Kodokan Judo, that was created by Jigoro Kano, was not the first style of jujitsu to use the term judo. It had previously been used to describe various forms or aspects about jujitsu in the past. Even Kano's Menkyo, or his license to teach the Kendo rule style of jujitsu, refers to judo specifically. However, we do not see a similar history of attaching Do to the names of classical Chinese or Korean art in a manner consistent with the Japanese martial arts. Even in Japan, this naming convention was not widespread before the emergence of Kodokan Judo in 1882. Generally speaking, a martial art with Do affixed to its name is either a Gendai Budo or a martial art closely derived from a Gendai Budo. But this doesn't imply that the concept of Do was absent in classical Korean or Chinese martial arts. Rather, it was not part of their naming conventions within their combative traditions. It's important to remember that Do can be viewed through varying lenses, and some of those lenses are quite broad. Differing traditions exist to try to express the concept or define it. Untangling these varied traditions has led to some confusion. For example, despite assertions in some of the Taekwondo literature that Kano intended Do in Judo to be primarily understood on Confucian grounds, and despite the emphasis that some of Kano's biographers place on his reliance on Confucianism, this perspective is too limited. Kano indeed did put Confucian frameworks into Kodokan Judo, and sometimes explained his ideas in a way that borrowed from Confucianism or that dovetailed with it. Kano had the learning to do so and received a mixed but scholarly education, which included studies in the Confucian classics. However, Kano's education was quite broad, and he himself was eclectic in terms of where he derived his ideas and his terminology. In other words, there is a risk here of overemphasizing Kano's Confucian connections and overlooking or misunderstanding philosophies at the very heart of Judo. To understand why Do became attached to the martial arts like Judo and eventually Taekwondo, we need to explore the educational philosophies that influenced Jigoro Kano. I've already mentioned in a prior essay that the Taekwondo concept of Musu, Muye, Mudo, which is a fairly recent construct in the Korean Hapkido or Taekwondo world, is probably closely related to the three stages of Judo and the three culture model of Judo. And in turn, the three culture model of Judo was inspired by the 1861 book Education, Intellectual, Moral, and Physical by the British utilitarian philosopher Herbert Spencer. As explained by Lance Gatling in his 2021 article, The Origins and Development of Kano Jigoro's Judo Philosophies. A quick note on that work, Lance Gatling in that article probably has done the most important English language analysis of judo, the most relevant piece of scholarship in the last 50 years, in my view. So if you haven't checked that one out, go see that one. It's awfully important. Spencer's idea of emphasizing a complete education to balancing intellectual, moral, and physical teaching became deeply rooted in the Japanese public education system in the 1880s. This concept is referred to in Japan as the Sanikyu Shugi, the three educations. This educational reform was implemented through the efforts of Japan's first Minister of Education, Mori Arinori, a former Satsuma samurai and a member of the Society of Meiji Six, the Merokusha, who were immensely influential in defining early compulsory education in Japan. Jigoro Kano served directly under Mori Aranori, who headed a government education committee that in 1888 produced a book known as the Ethics Text, a textbook for the use of middle and normal schools. Normal schools in this case means high school. This Renrisho textbook was designed to align closely with Herbert Spencer's work, The Principles of Ethics. Kano embraced these principles as part of his core philosophies of judo, and in fact, he was extensively trained in them. He had a year-long postgraduate seminar in modern ethics specifically. So, ironically, Mori Arinori was assassinated by one of Kano's early judo students, Nishino Buntaro, in 1889, the year after the ethics textbook was published. Although that had nothing to do with judo. While the Renrishu ethics textbook was primarily based on Spencer's work, the broader moral education, or shushinho, used in the Japanese education system was more dominantly influenced by theories of an earlier Swiss education theorist, Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi, who lived from 1746 through 1827. In my experience, Pestalozzi is somewhat forgotten about in American education, except in American early childhood education, where he remains quite respected. So Pestalozzi advocated through learning through head, heart, and hands, is how it's sometimes summarized, promoting an active and sensory-based methodology of education. Pestalozzi's theories directly influenced moral education in Japan. They also partially shaped Spencer's work, which the Japanese government likewise adopted to help create the new educational framework. So Pestalozzi's theories were twice influential in Japan, once directly, but also in that he influenced Spencer's ethics. This moral education was fundamental to establishing the new Japanese government and the emerging Japanese sense of national identity. The goal was never to create a westernized citizen, but rather to use education as a method of nation building in Japan in the 1880s. So Kano had received formal postgraduate training in ethics, and he was highly familiar with these new social ethical principles. So Kano integrated these educational philosophies into judo. So the three stages of judo are lower judo, which is judo in terms of physical technique, middle judo, judo in terms of physical and mental education, and upper judo, which is judo for a personal and societal good via the best use of personal energy. So these three stages upon which a judoka progresses appear quite similar to the three culture model of judo. In fact, they are possibly just Jigoro Kano explaining the same thing in a slightly different way. The three culture model specifically refers to the three benefits judo training provides to students as envisioned by the founder. This is the point of judo, and this is why one should study it. So these three benefits or cultures are: judo would teach a student self-defense or shobuho. Judo would teach physical fitness, rentaiho, or sometimes referred to as taikyo-ho. Judo would provide moral training or shushin-ho. So we can further describe this moral training or shushin-ho along three additional components: tokuiku, or moral education; chi-iku, or intellectual development; and shobunu rinran no oyo, so applying the principles of combat to everyday life. So we can see a clear connection in Kano's work to both Herbert Spencer and Pestalozzi, but here again we must be careful not to overlimit where Kano took inspiration. Kano was influenced by a wide range of thinkers, including figures as diverse as the radical French socialist Ferdinand Edouard Bosson and the Western-turned Japanese educator Lafcadio Hearn. I think it's most correct to say that Kano bought and sold his ideas using the intellectual currencies of his day, and why he sometimes explained his ideas using secular or Western philosophy. He also would sometimes explain his ideas using terminology or concepts derived from Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucianism. So, all that being said, it's true that a significant portion of Kano's core judo philosophy was closely tied to Western philosophers, especially Herbert Spencer. And this has been known in the more detailed judo scholarship for some time. And while it wasn't just Kano, Spencer was arguably the most influential philosopher in both Europe and Japan in the latter half of the 1800s. In the 1870s in Japan, the Gono, or the wealthy farmers, sponsored village study groups for lesser farmers and other provincials where they read Western politics and studied Spencer and other Western philosophers. In fact, Gatling 2021 writes Spencer was so popular in Japan in the 1870s and 1880s that they were described as a Spencer boom, as his ideas informed a range of discussions among the elite planning and creating a new Japan. In the early 1880s, as Kano was completing his education, starting his teaching career, and founding Kodokan Judo, Confucianism in Japan was not the dominant philosophical paradigm of the government. The period between 1872 and 1879 is often dubbed the Bunmei Kayak, excuse me, the Civilization and Enlightenment subperiod, known for a predisposition towards Westernization. Multiple traditional and new Western philosophies were in competition during this period. So, as I've written elsewhere, traditionalist sentiment, including Confucianism, resurged at points in the 1870s and 1880s. It is more correct to say that various traditional and progressive forces were tidal, ebbing in and out during this period. Moreover, various positions were being altered by their advocates to better compete against each other. For example, although a form of Neo Confucianism had been dominant in the government prior to the Meiji Restoration, it was not the same variation of Confucianism that was being advocated in the 1880s. Despite the initial Western inclinations, the government's educational policy eventually leaned back towards Confucian structures. This shift was strategic, solidifying Emperor Meiji's centralized position and acting as a counterbalance against emerging democratic ideologies in the late 1880s. The Meiji Constitution and the Imperial Rescript of Education of 1890 are the clearest examples of these changes, having a dominant Confucian influence both in language and philosophy. So, in other words, Jigoro Kano integrated various philosophical ideas prevalent during his time into the development of judo. He was clear on why he called his art judo, not jujitsu. Despite this, there tends to be wide misinterpretation of what Kano actually meant. This has led to some misunderstandings. Even classical Japanese martial arts were entrenched in ethical systems. Garcia in 2018 writes, during the Tokugawa period, martial ryu became stabilized, and Budo progressively attached in a more specific fashion to the code of conduct or morals of samurai, even though Bugei and Bujitsu at that time also transmitted this meaning. And as I have previously written, the code also existed within a social ethical framework, although it was specific to the Japanese early modern period. These ethics misaligned with the new social ethical framework of the early Meiji government, and therefore jujitsu was under cultural duress. The philosophical and moral underpinnings of the old school jujitsu were at odds with the government philosophies of the early Meiji Restoration. This was not unique to the old schools of Japanese martial arts. So, broadly speaking, Japanese artists and intellectuals who were more consistent with the prior social ethics of the preceding Shogunal government, the Tokugawa government, were culturally marginalized as a matter of government policy. Jigoro Kano wrote, even if I wanted to teach jujitsu, most people had now stopped thinking about it. So I thought it better to teach under a different name, principally because my objectives were much wider than jujitsu. Kano was making it clear that his art aligned with the emergent social ethical frameworks that the Japanese government was promoting in the 1880s. In fact, Kano was part of these efforts directly. The Japanese government was using compulsory public education to construct a Japanese identity, especially through the use of moral education. In other words, the Japanese educator Jigoro Kano renamed and reconstructed jujitsu to align it with the broader movement to use the Japanese public education system to create a new Japanese identity, namely one that was loyal to the new government. Kano's reformulation of jujitsu experienced progressive growth from the early 1880s through the end of the century. During this time, judo gained important ground in both the military and the police. Kano taught numerous students in public education and in judo who would become highly influential in Japanese society. After the turn of the century, three additional cultural factors greatly propelled judo forward. So the first was nationalism and military interest. There was a surge of nationalism and interest in military affairs following the Japanese victories in the First Sino or Chinese Japanese War of 1894 through 1895, and especially after the victory in the Russo Japanese War of 1904 through 1905. There was a reformulation of Bushido. The concept that Bushido was reinterpreted in the 1890s and early 1900s by certain Japanese scholars and intellectuals. The Japanese government eventually co opted and leveraged this emergent trend of thought, even though the Bushido theorists were never really a unified movement to begin with, and often were trying to use um, a somewhat invented tradition of Bushido to compete against each other. And also, there was an official recognition in the education system. Kano eventually succeeded in gaining official approval of judo as a method of physical education on a national level within the Japanese school system in 1911, although it took 3 attempts and some revisions to judo before he could successfully do that. So Kano had to go before basically the National Physical Education Board that consisted of three doctors. Two of the doctors were German, one was Japanese. And it took him several attempts to do that. Also, in the school system, there was no real shift in the Japanese textbooks until about 1910, where you saw an increase of Bushido type language. It happened pretty quickly. It happened very quickly in the Japanese military, but it lagged a bit in the Japanese education system. So, about the time Kano finally got judo systemically, nationally, into the Japanese school system, was the same time there was a shift of tone within the Japanese textbooks. And I think that's a relevant point as well. So, to summarize, by adopting Do to the name of what he was teaching, Kano deliberately broke from the immediate prior tradition of calling what he was teaching jujitsu. By doing this, he was able to separate himself from the baggage that came from with that specific term by cleverly adopting an existing but lesser used term, which was judo. In broader usage, both jitsu and do have both been used for a very long time when paired with budo and bujitsu. But in the case of jujitsu specifically, the term became the dominant term in the 1800s. And prior to this time, other terms for what we now call jujitsu were actually more common. What shifted was not the adoption of a moral, ethical framework into jujitsu, but a fundamental realignment of the total cultural model of early Kodokan Judo to one that would be consistent with and acceptable to the emerging social ethics propagated by the government of Japan. Innovations that arose within Kodokan Judo, such as the use of a uniform consisting of trousers, jacket, and a cloth belt, a clear ranking system later paired with colored belts as symbols of rank, and a pedagogy influenced by Western educational philosophy, became a template for other aspiring Japanese martial arts. Japanese martial arts seeking recognition by the Dai Nippon Budokai, or the Greater Japanese Martial Virtue Society, which operated as an appendage of the Japanese government, copied liberally from the template provided by Judo. So the introduction of Do into the name of a given Japanese martial art became evidence that a pre existing martial art had now realigned itself with the new social ethics that would conform to expectations, or that a foreign martial art or concept had realigned itself with this culture. This was certainly the case for the essentially foreign martial art of karate, which became naturalized in Japan in part through Jigoro Kano's direct support and encouragement. The concept of do began as a symbol of adherence, and it went further still, even so far as to extend to Western sports that had begun to be practiced in Japan, such as baseball. These foreign sports were under attack in Japan by nationalists and were put on the defensive after the First Sino Japanese War. The scholar Oleg Benich writes Bushido was also used to promote sumo and other martial arts with a less obvious connection to the samurai class. However, the even recently imported games such as baseball, in these cases, especially the latter, Bushido was invoked to give patriotic and historical legitimacy to these sports to counter attacks from promoters of judo and kendo who saw them as unwelcome competitors. So, in other words, as these foreign Western sports began to emerge in Japan, um, some of the martial arts that had adopted the do suffix, their promoters, their advocates were attacking the sports. And we see something really interesting happen. We see that the Japanese promoters of these Western sports tried to realign these sports with the Budo concept. So the advocates of such clearly foreign sports reinvented themselves in a way that aligned with the Budo, going so far as to brand baseball as Yakyudo, the way of baseball. So Bennett writes, as the author and critic Takayama Chogyu argued in an 1898 article, the martial arts were effective for instilling courage in the individual, but baseball was also superb for spiritual training. Unlike the martial arts, which focused on man-to-man combat, baseball brought together two groups of nine individuals together into a team unit where they attacked and defended together over the course of nine battles. In the context of inter-civilizational struggles, Takayama continued, it was essential for the individual to give up his own self interest for the good of the group. So, in his words, the problem facing Japan was that the people of our country have always had a very strong individual spirit, but are wanting in their communal spirit. After World War II, the Allied occupation authorities banned the martial arts in Japan due to their association with militarism and imperial ideology. Okay, the spiritual and ethical aspects of martial arts of Do were downplayed or removed to create distance and distance from former militaristic connotations. By the 1950s, with the onset of the Cold War, policies had shifted, and the Supreme Allied Command of Douglas MacArthur approved the reinstatement of martial arts like judo and the education and sports institutions. So we are at 6:45, and I promised we'd be done by 7. I think we're gonna call this short in just a second and not continue. We'll save it for another day. Um, Real quick, I do want to mention that we see this idea of Do in Japan. Just kind of review for a second. It had become broad. Budo or Bushido was being used broadly after the turn of the 20th century, after 1900, to help build a sense of what it meant to be Japanese. And so the Japanese government didn't start this intellectual current, but it did seize upon it. And at the same time, a lot of the advocates for the Budo, Karate Do, and Judo, after these currents emerged after 1905, they saw a swell in their numbers. Their numbers may have already been going up before, but in the writings of both Kano and in the writing of the founder of Shotokan Karate, that had moved to Japan, they both noted an increase in their numbers um, after those wars we spoke about. So I think that's relevant, and I think the last thing I want to talk about just briefly is the enigma of Kano. So Kano made it very clear in his writing that his view was passive towards the inclusion of judo in the Olympics. The problem is that's inconsistent with his actions. The last chapters of Kano's life were spent as an advocate for sport in general. He wasn't just an advocate for amateur and international sports, including judo. And he wasn't just an important figure, he was the advocate. He literally died advocating for the Olympics in Tokyo. He died on the return trip at sea. And so when we look at Kano's words and some of his notes of caution, I do think we have to be mindful that many of his own students and many of the most vocal judo advocates were some of the people being who were doing some of the greatest criticism of Western sports and of sports in general. And so I think that's why we see some notes of caution from Kano when he talks about sport and judo being a sport, even though his own actions are pretty plain. So we'll end with that little enigma, that little paradox, and I'll thank everyone for listening. I'm sorry we had some technical issues. We will look forward to doing a second version later on and maybe revisiting this first version as well. I want to thank everyone for coming and listening. My appreciation to all of you. So we'll sign off at this point.